Evening everyone, welcome back to the channel. What we're going to be looking at today is actually disassembling and reassembling, or rather reassembling and rejetting this particular carburettor, which is a Volkswagen carburettor. So it's a Solex and it's a 28 picked one. These were on early Beetles, single ports. They were on karmann ghias, early buses and stuff like that. There's a few different variants of these. You got your 28, you got your 30, you got your 34, you got picked 1, 2, 3 and so on, and fundamentally the way they work is exactly the same. So whatever your application, your carburetor design is basically the same, and you can rebuild it like this. So if you're wondering about your carburetor and where to start on your Volkswagen, then this is probably as good a place as any, because I've already dismantled this one, and we're going to start putting it back together. It's been cleaned and everything like that, given a little bit of a polish, but we'll start with what the parts are and beginning to put them back together. So throttle plate I didn't actually remove, but I did clean it up, and the bushings it rides in, they're not amazing, but they don't leak. There's no sort of lateral play in there. There is obviously that way, and as I say, we'll put that together. I've taken the choke mechanism out, and we can reassemble the choke mechanism and the needle valve and the electric choke itself, as well as the choke plate there. And in here we can put together the accelerator pump, which goes there, the idle jets, the main jets, and the mixture screw down there. So I will just be talking whilst I'm assembling it. I've got some spare parts over here. Most of these parts came from Classic Carbs, so they sell a lot of Solex parts. They sell a lot of other parts as well, but they're really good for getting hold of Solex bits, which can be a little bit difficult to get hold of. Sorry if the angle of this is a bit odd. I'm filming this portrait but landscape, so like I'm looking in this direction, but I've got to hold stuff like that so you can see what I'm talking about. So feel free to hit them up if you need any of the parts that you see in this video. Got a rebuild kit as well, with a whole bunch of gaskets that we're going to use. We may as well start from the bottom, and we'll start with the main jet. So the main jet in this comes in a holder. I've removed the main jet there, and what I'll do is I'll fit one of the new main jets here. Now, I'm not sure what engine this originally came off, but it probably wouldn't have been fitted with this size of jet, because I'm actually planning on running this on a 499cc Fiat 500. So I've specified this out with a 112.5 main jet, which is ever so slightly larger than is recommended by the book. The book recommends a 110 for this size engine, but this the Venturi on this is 23mm, and they also recommend having a 22mm Venturi. So having the slightly larger one means the airflow is going to be ever so slightly slower at low revs, and so therefore we need a bigger main jet to actually get the fuel in, because the Venturi is not going to be sucking so hard. So the bolt there, as you saw, the main jet just mounts in the back of that. There's a sealing washer on there, and it just screws in there. Doesn't matter whether these holes line up in here, because probably can't even see in there. There's a hole from the float bowl down into that main jet, but because that main jet's shouldered, or that main jet holder is shouldered, it will always, the fuel will always get around there. So we'll flip it over on the other side, and we will install, if I can find where I've put it, we will install the idle jet or the slow running jet. Now, depending on your version of this carburettor, if it's a larger one or a later one, you may well have this connected to a 12-volt idle cutoff, which is basically a solenoid that has this mounted on the back of it, and all that does is when the ignition is off, it effectively closes this and means that you are going to have no fuel potentially leaking down and flooding your engine. So that there again just screws in from the side there, goes into where the idle port is, so I shall stick that back in there. Now this is a 0.45, which is the right size for the Fiat application. I know it's the right size because it's the same as what comes on the standard Weber. And then in the top here you have your emulsion tube and your air correction jet. Now, as standard on the VWs, these come with the 60Z, I think, air correction jet, which is quite small. I did check as to what the size on the standard Weber was, and it was a 2.3mm one. So I ordered a 210, which is the largest size they do for this particular application, and the thing's like a massive fire hose. So I'm going to leave it. I'm going to leave it as the standard 60. Reason for that is because if you run too big an air correction jet, what you do is you effectively reduce the fuel flow at high revs, because the fuel flows into here based on vacuum. The air correction jet is basically a controlled vacuum leak. So even though we've got a larger main jet, I think we might need to step that up a little bit, but stepping it up by the amount that I had planned is way too big and would just result in it running completely lean at wide open throttle or at high revs. So that's your basic setup. You've got your jets in there, and in here you have your idle control screw, and I have a new one here, and this is basically, again, it's an air bleed. So what it does is, as you screw it in, it closes off airflow here, and as you open it, it allows more airflow past, which in turn sucks more fuel in, and it has a little spring on there to hold it in place. Now, if I just stick that in there, the general rule for doing these on any type of carb is you gently screw them down until they seat, because there is a taper on the end. There's also a taper in the carburetor body, and what you don't want to do is jam it down so hard that it damages either of those, or else it will never seal properly. Now we can put an initial setting on there of number of turns out, which is usually 1, 1.5, 2. So we'll set 2 turns out on that, and we can adjust that for your lean mixture, or sorry, for your idle mixture, as and when it's on the car. And there is one more part that needs to go in here, which I will admit I'm going to have to buy a new one of, because this one is knackered, but for the purpose of today I will put that in there, and that is actually where your pump jet comes out for your accelerator pump. So this has an accelerator pump on it, so you can effectively, when you go to wide open throttle, it squirts an additional bit of fuel in there to offset the fact that switching from the idle circuit to the main circuit is a little slower to respond. So whilst we're here, on the bottom we can assemble the accelerator pump. See if I can find the screws for this in a minute. That's this, okay? It connects onto the back side of the throttle, and as it pulls round, it basically does a little squirt here by prodding this section here onto the back of this diaphragm, which then causes pressure in here, which forces fuel up through that jet there. So there's a few different bits to this. You have the diaphragm, you have that assembled part, and you have a spring, which I have lovingly misplaced somewhere. There it is, which sits in here. And there's your diaphragm, and the whole thing sits in there. So we'll align that up there, and see if I can get a screw in there just to hold it in place for the moment. Obviously there are 4 screws to hold this in place. Now when I first got the carb, one of those screws was missing, but I'll see if I can hunt around in here and find at least a couple that I can use to get that in. And we'll just temporarily hold that in place. So what you've got is, as that pulls, it's going to make a little squirt in there. So that's your accelerator pump, as I say, not fully held on there. And everything else is there on the bottom, with one exception, which is quite important, which is your float. Now when you're putting these back together, you want to make sure you polish up that pin so that it doesn't stick. So the float should swing nicely in there, and the float simply sits in there like that. As the fuel comes in, fills up, pushes that up like that, and that's what allows your fuel to cut off so that you don't flood everything. And what we have in between all of that is we have a gasket that sits on there like that. Now, because I know that this is knackered and this bit needs to come off and be replaced with one that actually has a hole in it, I'm not going to install the gasket for the moment, but it sits in the middle there like that. So we can kind of call that bit done for the moment, and what we can do is we can move on to looking at the top plate of the carburetor. Now in the top plate you have a needle valve. Now the old needle valve that I've got for this and the new needle valve are slightly different. Again, I'm going to have to do a little bit of double checking, but it does look, when they're seated, like these should sit down to the same height. And the important thing is not the design of the body of this, the important thing is the end of the needle valve needs to be the same height. Otherwise you'll end up with your fuel bowl being either too full or not full enough. There are spacers and washers that go in here. I'm not going to put any spacers in there, but I will just stick a washer in there and I'll install that there. Now if I find that the fuel level in the bowl is too low or too high, I can adjust the depth of this needle valve by adding or removing spacers, or alternatively just changing it back for one that's the same design as the one that came out, as opposed to the one that came in this rebuild kit. There's your fuel inlet, and as I say, the needle valve there is, when it's down, it's allowing fuel in. When that float bowl fills up, pushes on there, cuts fuel off, stops it from flooding. Now in this section is where your choke comes. This has an air choke, which is a plate like this, and it's connected to a 12-volt controller. So instead of being controlled by pulling on a choke cable, this one is adjusted by means of a bimetallic spring. Now this doesn't actually go in straight away because there's a bit that needs to go in first. The controlling of the motion of this is done by another little diaphragm which goes in here. Again, this is two parts. There is a spring and then there is a diaphragm. So we've got the spring there and the diaphragm. This bit here pulls on the bottom there and ensures that the choke, when it's cold, returns to its correct position. So just like the previous one, for the accelerator pump, there is a cover that goes over there, and we just need to align all of the holes. So I went off camera a bit there, and get the cover on, and then we'll get some screws in there. I can find some screws that fit, that is, because my pile of screws is not as organised as it should be. I did have everything in a little magnetic bowl as I was dismantling this, and sort of still do, but some of the bits seem to have moved around. Okay, now I've managed to find a screwdriver small enough to fit that. We'll get that in there. And oh yeah, that's why that wasn't going down, because it's not actually the right way round. There is a position where that's supposed to go, because there is a little brass knob, and then there is a little hole for said brass knob to go into. So let's do this properly, or let's not do it at all, eh? Now the lesson here is, when you're trying to rebuild a carb, don't try and do it one-handed whilst filming it. But there is our little diaphragm controlled and spring controlled section there, which means that now what we can do is we can install our choke spindle. Now this was a bit stiff removing it, it's probably going to be equally stiff getting it back in. Pause that for a second and give it a little tap. Okay, so you go, a little tap in there, and we've got that into position, and it rotates as it should do. That there will pull that diaphragm out, and as it comes back down again, or as that pulls in, it will pull it back in. So what we can do now, if I can twist that around so it's vaguely vertical in there, and I can then install the choke plate itself. So just push that in. Got hit in the head by a moth there. Just tap that. Get a little bit of wood or something to use as a drift there. Don't really want to hit it directly with a hammer. So I'm just going to prop it up against something here. And you know it's in properly when the screw holes align, and we'll put the screws in properly later on. But what you can see there, if I push that to close it fully, over here it pulls on that diaphragm which wants to pull it back. So when your 12-volt throttle, 12-volt choke actuator is in there, as it's going to pull it like that, and it's going to allow it to open fully. So I've got a feeling that isn't quite right in terms of intuition, but that is how it goes together. I'll put those screws in there later on. Now with the actual choke mechanism itself, and again I appreciate that this one is ever so slightly tatty looking. What you've got is a bimetallic strip in here with a little hook, and there is a connection here and one here. This is your 12-volt in, this is going to be your earth, which is earth to your carburettor body. And to install these, basically what you do is you get the little hook here and the little hook there, and you hook that onto it, and you can adjust how fast or slow these come on by adjusting the starting position effectively, by twisting that around. And so we can't do that now, but we can sort of fiddle with that once it's all together. Your cover plate goes on there, and then this is your earthing ring that just bolts or screws into there like that. As I say, what we'll do is we'll put the rest of the screws in later on. So what you've got there is the top part of the carburettor is now finished, as I say, except for those missing screws, which I'm only not putting in yet because it's a demonstration rather than the final install. That then drops down on the top there like that. Again, I'm just going to remove the gasket because it's not the final install. And then what we can do is just bolt the two bits together. Again, do make sure when you're doing this finally that you have all of the screws in, and you're not just doing what I'm doing here and chucking in a couple for the purpose of a YouTube video. Okay, so there's our top and bottom of the carb joined together. And what we then need to do is to start to assemble the mechanism for the throttle linkage. Now that comes in a number of different parts, of which again I have the majority of them here. Depending on your application, these may look slightly different, but you have your main throttle actuator there where your throttle cable or pulley mechanism comes from there. And again, we have a nut which holds this in place. This is a bit of a rusty one, so I am going to replace this when I do final assembly, as it does look a little bit naff. but it serves its purpose. So opens the throttle like that there, and then it is slightly loose still. I think I'm missing a spring washer. Again, I'll put a spring washer in there before the final assembly. And then what we've got is on the top, which goes onto the back end of the choke mechanism, is you have a fast idle cam. Now I've got a fully assembled one here that you can look at. What this does here is, well, it does two things. For a start, it allows you to set your idle speed with a screw there, and secondly, as I say, it has a fast idle cam on it, which basically what it means is, as the choke comes fully on, it kicks the throttle plates ever so slightly open and raises your idle speed slightly, which means you're much less likely to end up with a stall situation. Now again, hands up, when I dismantled this, I did slightly mislay one or two of the parts for this. That would be one of them, which needs to be tapped in there. And there's a couple of other parts that I have mislaid, but basically what happens is that goes on there and is then bolted into position. So we'll just roughly stick a bolt in there, if I stick a nut, I should say, in there, if I can find one even of vaguely the right size, just to give you some sort of idea as to how the finished product looks. And it looks a little bit like that. Okay, so you've got your main jets, you've got your idle control valve, you have your idle jet, you have your choke mechanism, electronic choke, you have your choke plates, you have your squirter for your accelerator pump, or you have your accelerator pump jet, I should say. You have your squirter for your accelerator pump, and then connected on the back here is actually where that slides, if I can get the angle correct, where that slides on and actually enables the pump jet, there you go, enables the pump jet to work. So as we put on a quick burst of throttle, you can see hopefully on the video, it pushes on there and gives you your squirt of throttle. So that is now, well, temporarily thrown together for the purpose of the video, but is going to be set up ready to go onto a little Fiat 500 that you'll see in a future episode. So all done in one take, 28 minutes start to finish, including me gassing, losing tools, etc. Give yourself an hour to reassemble yours properly and make sure you have everything laid out, and you'll find it a hell of a lot easier. Well, if you liked that, feel free to feel free to subscribe, give us a follow, whatever. We've got a whole range of content that we do here on the channel, and hopefully you'll find some of it quite interesting. Till the next time, take care.